Before we get into our show today, I just want to state that as of this recording, SAG AFTRA and the Writers Guild of America are on strike as we speak. Since these episodes will focus on films that were written by actual people, whether they were part of the WGA or not, I figured I would address the elephant in the room, so to speak. The Lone Screenplay Nominee podcast endorses those creative artists who are picketing for better wages and do not be replaced by AI. We hope you guys can get a justified deal done with those greedy snakes in Hollywood. If you're listening to this and don't agree as to why these wonderful people are out on strike, you might want to start reading the room, especially you, Bob Iger. When you have people like Jane Fonda or even Meryl Streep out there picketing, you know you messed up. If anyone is interested in supporting those who are striking, I'll make sure to post in the description where you can donate to those in need during this unfortunate time. The last word I'll say to the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers: please pay the money. Hello, listeners. Welcome to the Lone Screenplay Nominee podcast, where we talk about films that were solely nominated for an Oscar in the writing categories. I'm your host, Matthew Anderson, and today we have Myles Hughes, who is an actor slash filmmaker and is a co-host on Awards Radar podcast. Welcome to the show, Myles. How are you doing today?
I'm great, Matt, and thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here on your inaugural episode.
Yeah, thanks. Again, I really appreciate it. Having you being on here, despite the a couple of hiccups and delays along the way, but that's life. It happens. Um, s- so
Absolutely.
before we start our review for the show, our review for the movie we're gonna do for this episode. I have a couple questions I want to ask you, Miles, if you don't mind answering some of these. Would you care to explain to our listeners, for those who aren't familiar with who you are or what you do, uh, what is it exactly? What do you do for Awards Radar podcast, or even what is it about?
Yeah, totally. So, Awards Radar is a site started by my friend, and I guess technically he's my boss, but I don't treat him that way. Joey Magidson, and he has, of course, been, well, we have both been covering awards in some way, shape, or another for well over a decade. I started all the way back in high school, personally. I think he did too, or at least early
Hmm.
college. And yeah, so he started Awards Radar a couple years ago and invited me to come along for the ride. And truthfully, most of what I do there is I'm the co-host on the podcast and I'm the regular there. I do write the occasional article. Frequently, my schedule doesn't allow me to do much more than that, just because, like Matt mentioned, I'm also an actor and a filmmaker. I've got a couple of short films that are out and about on YouTube that I'm sure I'll get to sprug at the end. But otherwise, I love talking about movies. I love the Oscars. I love all this kind of stuff. So I just love having a format to go on about it.
And just double checking, you're going to be in a play in the next couple months. Am I correct in saying that?
You are. Thank you very much. Yes, it's called The Play That Goes Wrong, and it's going to be set up in the Albuquerque Little Theater, running September 8th through 24th.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure. Yeah, because I was like, wait, isn't Miles in an upcoming play he'll be doing? Okay. Well, I can tell you,
Oh yeah.
this though from my own experience with high school and a little bit of community college. I wish you the best of luck with that, and hopefully nothing goes terribly wrong with the production, not only just through rehearsals but on the actual show itself.
Oh, thank you very much, especially because it's a show where everything's supposed to go wrong by design. So doing things wrong on purpose gives it a whole nother layer of complexity that I can't wait to get into.
Speaking of performance and arts, it's really tough for me to ask anyone in general, or even to answer this question of what their favorite film is, so to speak. So I might as well ask you, maybe put a little bit of a spin on it. What's your favorite genre of film?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question because I have my favorite genres, but the funny thing is when I think about like my favorite films, it's not necessarily films within those genres, which is kind of
Mhm.
interesting. Cuz like I would say my favorite genre just on its own would be horror because I think horror has so much potential complexity within it and so many subgenres within it. that it can kind of take on so many different forms. Anyone who follows me on Twitter or on Awards Radar will know that every October, my wife and I do 31 Days of Halloween, where we go through 31 different horror movies. But it's all, horror and horror adjacent stuff. So, we're doing Your Nightmare on Elm Streets, but we're also doing like Paranorman and Hocus Pocus, or, we'll throw like an audition in there and, some stuff from the 80s and just a real grab bag. And you really get to see all the variety that the genre has to offer.
Nice. Yeah. The horror is definitely a genre that I would like to explore a bit more of, personally. I'm pretty sure just like any other genre, for as many great ones you get through, great movies you get through in a certain genre, you also got to wade through a lot of the crappier ones, and that's part of the reason why I haven't seen a whole lot of horror movies. Like the Nightmare on Elm Streets, I haven't seen a whole lot of. I haven't even seen any of the Friday the 13th films except for the shitty reboot they did with, produced, what was it, by Platinum Dunes, I think? Um,
Oh yeah, it was part of a wave of those.
yeah, so
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's, for every masterpiece, there are absolutely, 10 to 20 pieces of crap that you got to wade through.
yeah. But yeah, so, like I said, once again, I'm really grateful that you're here on the show. And today we're gonna segue into our discussion for our 2019 film Knives Out. Just to let the audience know, this won't be a beat by beat bulletin point presentation, like you hear on other channels that I may have been on in the past, such as the Fast and Furious films, where I kid you not, it took us like I think 3.5 hours. It was like a whole group of us discussing Furious 7 for 3.5 hours long, and the host, who I have to give credit for trying to cobble the whole thing together and make sure we were on track. Had to edit it into two different parts, but it was nuts. But this won't be like that at all, for our episode today, or for the show that I am intending on doing. But we will be discussing major spoilers for our discussion for the film we're talking about today. If you haven't seen Knives Out yet and want to hear our full thoughts on it, I'd suggest you watch the film first and then come back afterwards to hear us talk about it in detail. So, Knives Out was directed and written by Ryan Johnson, famously known for Star Wars The Last Jedi and Looper. After working on a 2005 film Brick, Ryan came up with the basic concept for this film and expressed interest in making an Agatha Christie inspired murder mystery film back in 2010. It wasn't until after the press tour for The Last Jedi did Ryan finally sit down and spent 7 months working on the screenplay. Some of the stories and films he was inspired to create this material were Murder on the Orient Express, Clue, and Gosford Park. Ryan Johnson assembled his cast in 2018 after his script was sold to distributors at Toronto International Film Festival the same year. One note I do want to bring up in regards to the cast was Michael Emmett Walsh replaced Ricky Jay, as the latter had passed away during production. This was also Christopher Plummer's final film performance he shot before he passed away on February 5th, 2021. Knives Out premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival and was released theatrically on November 27th, 2019, with a worldwide gross of $311 million on a production budget of $40 million. Including its sole Oscar nomination for original screenplay, the film was also nominated for a BAFTA, a Writers Guild Award nomination in the original screenplay category, along with getting 3 Golden Globe nominations and 3 Critics' Choice Award nominations. In terms of what the premise is, I'll just give you the quick log line. A private detective by the name of Benoit Blanc analyzes through a web of lies while questioning Harlan Thrombey's dysfunctional family after he's murdered. And for just to double check with Miles here, our guest, I wanted to ask if this was your first time watching the movie, and if not, do you recall what your initial thoughts were on the film when you first had seen it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I saw this one in theaters. I was already sort of very much looking forward to it. I've been on board with Ryan Johnson ever since I saw Brick in theaters
Oh
way
wow!
back in 2005. Yeah, I want to say, because that made me think about it. I want to say when we saw that in theaters, they were still projecting it on film. That's how long ago that feels
Wow.
like. But yeah, so yeah, from Brick onwards, I've always felt like he has just an uncanny knack for genre, and whichever one he tries to focus on, he tends to have a way of sort of subverting it while still relishing in the things that make each genre fun. So whether that be about con artists or sort of a hard-boiled noir or what have you, he's putting his own spin on it while still very much respecting what came before. And I think that absolutely translates to the Agatha Christie style murder mystery that you get in Knives Out. I think you see in every detail of the film his reverence for the genre and his reverence for some of the great stories that came before. But at the same time, he's sort of interrogating the tropes and sort of trying to subvert your expectations without necessarily being cutesy about it. I know The Last Jedi gets a lot of, I feel, undeserved flack for like being more about subverting expectations than anything of substance. But I think what sets Ryan Johnson apart as a storyteller is his ability to use that particular storytelling tool, not just as a gotcha, but as a way to sort of make you reconsider everything that's come before and sort of enrich everything overall by giving it that additional layering.
Interesting. Yeah, yeah, actually come to think of it, Looper was another case. It's been a while since I've seen Looper, maybe about a good decade or so, but I remembered Looper was another case of a film that was that played around with the tropes within its own genre while also doing some new takes on it, with the whole time travel thing and the science fiction elements to it as well. And yeah,
Yeah, very much so.
what was your reaction towards this on your recent rewatch for the movie compared to when you first saw it?
Sure. I mean, it's kind of interesting with this one because truthfully, I do go back. I've gone back to it a few times since I've seen it.
Okay.
So because I've owned it on Blu-ray for a hot minute now, which is great because if it's not on streaming, I can still watch it anyway. Support physical media. Um, and so yeah, it's one that we go back to, not like a ton, but I would say once a year, every 2 years, we've circled back around, and obviously we revisited it last year in anticipation of Glass Onion. And then yeah, I rewatched it probably sometime in the past week for this. So it's one that is always fun to go back to because of how intricately layered, speaking of the lone screenplay, the screenplay is, and how much it sort of rewards a rewatch because now you're looking for certain details or you realize little mini things like, little gestures, little things that you couldn't possibly know on the first watch would be significant. Suddenly, like the whole plot feels like it hinges on like what direction someone's looking at a key moment or like little things like that. So, yeah, when you're going back to it, whether analytically or just, having a good time, I feel like it's just such a rewarding experience. If I may then turn it around, what was your sort of experience with it?
I remembered so to make a long story short, I remembered seeing this, I think, on either it might have been Black Friday I saw this in the theaters because or maybe it was the day before Thanksgiving. I had
I
watched.
know it was that holiday weekend,
Yeah, and
yeah.
I remembered I had, earlier that day, I was gonna go see A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood by myself, and
Sure.
then I remembered, driving back to the house to pick up my brother, and we were gonna drive all the way back near the theater to spend time with our dad, and we were gonna watch Knives Out, and, yeah, like, as far as, like, my own history with Ryan Johnson, I probably haven't even seen nearly as many of Ryan's films as you have. I think the only ones I've seen were the Knives Out movies, the Last Jedi, and Looper. I think that might have been the only thing I've seen from him. But
Okay, so if that's the case, then you're only missing Brick and the Brothers Bloom.
yeah, yeah, that's pretty much it. But I mean, I like Ryan Johnson a lot, and even with this movie, I definitely appreciate him as a writer and director. And on I will say on my first watch, I enjoyed it. I thought it was good, and even when we started the film off with the whole Mar- I think it was Marta Cabrera, the Anna de
Mhm.
Armas character. I was a little bit worried that the film had sort of revealed all of its cards, because whenever you see these murder mysteries, because there's been lesser quality films where they're like, "Ooh, we actually have more cards under the table," but it's like, no, you showed your first cards in like the first 20 minutes, and you're expecting us to be like, ooh, remember that trick you're not supposed to remember? Well, we're gonna reveal that trick later in the film, and it's like, no, you ruined it. But as the film progressed, I was thinking to myself, "Oh, okay, that's why he included the whole, Marta Cabrera interaction with, Christopher Plummer's character Harlan, and revealing, like, we need to set this up so by the time we get to the finale, it'll tie back into what our conclusion is, and it's gonna be completely different from what some of you haven't expected. And yeah, so I enjoyed it on a first watch. I showed it to my grandma during the COVID pandemic, and I'm not even sure if we even talked about this, but I created a whole list of films for that my grandma and I have been watching since the pandemic started, and we've been quarantining. Obviously, we're not quarantining as much because it's not that big of an issue, but it's still going on. Um, we're still adding more films to that list. And along the way, we've seen some other classics and some really good ones. But yeah, Knives Out was another one, and uh, when my grandma had watched it, she thought, "Oh wow, this is actually a pretty interesting movie," and it definitely it was something I was not expecting. And I gotta say, on a rewatch this time around, now after seeing Glass Onion, and I've now seen it the third time, my thoughts on it are still the same. I agree with you that the screenplay, what's so rewarding about it is it's very detailed, and there's a lot of cues you could pick up on throughout the movie. One of which I actually really liked was the attention to detail in terms of the way the Thromby family interacted not only with each other but with characters outside of their house. For example, the very beginning of the movie, I loved how the way that Jamie Lee Curtis's character with Don Johnson, the way they interact with Marta Cabrera, it was interesting and unique, and it definitely showed like what their personalities was like already with just a few lines of dialogue. Like the way that Don Johnson, and when he interacts with her, and she's like, "Hey, how you doing?" And he's on his phone the whole time, texting someone or
Yeah,
doing video
yeah.
games. And even with Jamie Lee Curtis, it's very like this passive, like, "Oh, how are you doing?" I wish we were there for the. I wish you were there for the funeral, but I got outvoted and things like that. Even with Michael Shannon is another one too. It's like, I wish you were at the funeral, but I got outvoted too.
Yeah, they all suspiciously got outvoted.
Yeah, exactly. And I thought that was interesting, and just yeah, like the screenplay as a whole, I think is like the best part about the movie, not just with how like Ryan Johnson really did take the time to look through like what are some possible mistakes that I'm going to get into, and let's try to either tidy up in a rewrite, or let's try to tie that into the end of the film. Like even with the prop knife that Harlan brings up in the movie. Like
Yeah,
no
yeah.
one could really tell the difference between a prop knife and a real knife, and that ties into the very finale of the Chris Evans character as well. When he tries to
Yeah.
stab Marta Cabrera.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think you're right on point about all of that. One of my other favorite running gags throughout the family, speaking of sort of using the writing to sort of inform characterization, kind of similar to the outvoted gag, is the whole, oh, your housekeeper from Bolivia, or oh, your housekeeper from Chile. Like nobody knows where she's actually from,
Yeah.
but they all like kind of throw it off like they know or like they care. Or like there's the one bit where she kind of gets sucked into like kind of awkwardly having to have a conversation about
Yep.
immigration issues, and like she's clearly uncomfortable with it, but they're also acting like, oh, you're part of the family up to a point.
Mhm.
And going back to what you were saying before about potentially Ryan Johnson revealing his cards too early with the reveal, I want to say about like 30 minutes in, give or take, that Marta, at least as far as we're meant to understand at that point, it looks like she killed him. And yeah, I think a lesser story or a lesser filmmaker, that would absolutely be a case of giving up the goose too soon. But I think what it does here is it lets the first little stretch of it play out in kind of a little closer to maybe the more stereotypical murder mystery beats that we're expecting going in. But then you get that reveal, and then the murder mystery continues, but now we have this whole side story happening concurrently where you've got her kind of in the background of the investigation trying to throw off the investigation, which gives it a whole nother layer, not just of entertainment value, but then sort of adding on top of the mystery. Eventually, when then in the third act we find out that even the assumptions we made about that are then also turned on their head. So again, it's like this sort of nesting doll of ideas where like each time you think, or like, the glass onion metaphor from his next film, each time you sort of peel it back, you learn a little bit more about it, and suddenly the things that seem so innocuous at first are suddenly so vital to the results and the climax of the film, like you said, with the prop knife and with, I mean, honestly, a million other things.
Yeah, and the other aspect too in terms of the screenplay I really liked was I mentioned it a little bit briefly before, but with the way that Anna de Armas interacts with Christopher Plummer, like the established early on the kind of relationship they have, and that's sort of like one of the main emotional cruxes as to why we should care about Marta Cabrera. It isn't just because her mother and her sister are undocumented citizens, but it's also there to establish, that they were really close friends and almost like, you know, uh, she was treated almost like another, child or grandchild of Harlan Thrombey's, and I thought that was like a really like hiring someone as good of an actor as Christopher Plummer really does help. But what also helps too is again going back to that screenplay where you make us care by even just doing simple things like just having them play a game of Go, and then they're like joking, antagonizing each other, like this is the threat I'm calling the what was it the double ARP on you,
Yeah.
things like that. I was like, "Oh, wow," like, they like, right like I said, Ryan Johnson does a good job establishing us to care about Marta's situation, and it isn't just, "Oh, she's into a problem," and so on. One other aspect I think also works very strongly in the movie is obviously Benoit Blanc. Um, Daniel Craig is a
Sure.
really good actor. We've seen him time and time again, uh, you know, delivered some really good acting before, even in another mystery film that I think is quite underrated, Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, where
Yes, which in hindsight kind of feels almost like an audition for
yeah,
this.
yeah, and and but it's definitely an audition for this movie, but at the same time, the tone and vibe is completely
Oh no,
different.
it couldn't be more different. But in terms of how he fits into that like mystery thriller kind of vibe, like I don't know, there's something about the way that Daniel Craig like recites evidence and kind of goes over the fine details of a case that's just endlessly compelling.
Yeah, and even with the southern accent, which did take me back a little bit, I was like, "Wait, what's going on here?" And then it took me a while to get used to that, for me at least.
Totally. No, I've heard that before. It's not what you're expecting. I think it helped for some people that he did a similar accent in Logan Lucky like a year or two
That's
before,
right.
so that kind of helped like maybe buffer it out a little bit. But yeah, it is. He's going broad. He's taking big swings with it. But I think because the character is meant to be so flamboyant and ostentatious by design, I think the fact that his accent sounds a little bit larger than life and almost a little put on kind of only adds to that. And, not to, steer away from this movie too much, but we do see, kind of the advancement of that in Glass Onion when he starts, getting into even more fanciful costumes and like, kind of letting his more, effeminate quirks sort of, come out. And I don't know, it's such a great sort of modern take on like the Hercule Poirot or, Miss Marple kind of like detective character where they're a little quirky, but they're also really good at sort of getting you to let your guard down around them.
Yeah, and this is easily way better than the well, at least the Brana's take on Hercule Poirot.
Oh God, yeah.
Just in terms of like the filmmaking alone, and I think Kenneth Branagh can be a good actor, but in my opinion, as a director, he's just not that great with telling stories, unless if it's something like Shakespeare stuff, where it's like, okay, he's pretty good at this. Um,
Yeah.
but
No, I don't disagree.
yeah, the other aspect to the film I did want to talk about that ties into Marta Cabrera was I like that they establish not only her struggles and her relationship with Harlan Thrombey and even with Benoit Blanc, who they end up teaming up together as the film progresses. But the one aspect I feel could have, in lesser hands of a director and or writer, the idea of her puking every time she's telling a lie would easily be thrown as more of like a very, what do you call it, like gross out gag that you would see from like a teen comedy flick. And
Sure.
and I like that they established that as a way of, getting information from Marta, and it ties into the finale. The one aspect about it, I'm not sure if you'd agree with me on this, but the one, thing about it I wasn't that I thought Ryan Johnson did kinda cheat a little bit with, was when they were out in the backyard and, Benoit Blanc notices the footprints, and Marta Cabrera is stepping on the footprints, and then as Benoit Blanc's trying to tell her, don't step, don't move," and she's like, "What? What are you saying?" And she just, immediately steps on them because she's trying to cover her tracks. And I get that, like, later on, where it's revealed that those tracks could have easily been Ransom's, footprints, but at the same time, I thought that was a little bit of a cheat for me in terms of, like, establishing that, but overall, I thought that was, like, it clearly, outside of that one scene, it clearly established, whenever she lied or clearly was lying, she always puked and so on. But I wanted to ask if you agreed or disagree with me on that part.
Sure. I think that's one of those. I mean, you could call it a cheat, but I think it does get around it because she's not like she's not being mistruthful per se. She's not saying words that aren't correct. She's just, pretending that she can't hear, which I guess that does sort of like fall on like that kind of gray scale of like where does pretending and lying, like what's the line between them, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? So that's kind of up for interpretation, but I think they make it consistent enough with every other time that it happens that it's specifically when she says something mistruthful. I do think that what is so brilliant about that gag and what helps maybe prevent it from feeling, like you said, like sort of a gross out gag you would see in a lesser comedy, is that the gag itself is less about the spectacle of it. Like when she does throw up, it tends to be like into a vase or like, kind of off screen or in a cup or something. Like it's not about lingering on it. It's more about, if anything, it makes the character incredibly
Yeah.
relatable because it helps put you in her shoes of that sort of tension of, there's this consequence and she's like the worst possible person to have to cover her tracks for a thing like this because it requires finding ways to create scenarios where she doesn't have to lie, which is like in many ways so much more compelling than if she was just straight up lying to him. And again, I think Marta in many ways is the screenplay and just the movie's secret weapon.
Yep.
And going back to how fanciful and flamboyant Benoit Blanc is, I think you need a grounded character like Marta to sort of give the audience that perspective and give them that relatable window and a character that they can kind of root for in all of this. Because everyone else is, I mean, the Thrombey family is kind of the
Yeah.
worst. Like they're all the worst for one reason or
Mhm.
another. And one of them is the killer, to be sure, but none of them are great
Yeah.
people. So to have that sort of heart at the center of everything, I think helps sort of the nastiness that happens around her go down much smoother. And I think, yeah, it creates that sort of compelling back and forth with her and with Blanc, where she has to sort of work around this massive deficiencies she has. And then the only time they do linger on the gross outness of the throwing up is when she does it all over Ransom at the end, which is the perfect time to do it.
Yeah, and the fact that she was able to hold it in after she got that call from
Exactly.
the doctors, yeah. I'm actually glad you brought up the dynamic duo, but, like, the fact that Marta is more the grounded character and Benoit Blanc sort of the quirky character, because I feel like in a lesser film, like, let's say, Wild Wild West, in my opinion, both of
Sure.
the characters are quirky in their own ways, but neither of them are even grounded, and that was
Yeah, they're not different
yeah,
enough.
and that was part of my biggest issue with that film was that, like, okay, you're clearly trying to do comedic bits here, but it's not working because not only are the jokes not funny, but also the interactions between the two of them aren't genuine, and neither one of you plays this like grounded area or play a grounded character or within your performance. And that's another problem with all these like dynamic duos that you'd see in like when we get to later on to the Lethal Weapons sequels, like the farther we get away from that first one, the more cartoonish both of the characters are in that one too. And
Yeah.
I want to also circle back around because you brought up an interesting point too. with Marta Cabrera in that, we've already established that her mother and her sister are illegal citizens. And I find it really interesting, and I didn't notice this until this rewatch, is that with this and Glass Onion, I find it very strange, and maybe this is what the intention was for Ryan Johnson, is that he wrote these two films around a very crucial time that we were in with America because Knives Out was created during Trump's presidency, and I'm pretty sure there was like a whole idea of not idea, but like this what do you call it, mentality of like we need to put this push this agenda of getting rid of these illegal citizens out of the United States and go back to wherever they came from. And even with Glass Onion, it was also written not just during the pandemic, but it also played kind of a central role around the time that the characters were living in. And I find that really interesting that Ryan Johnson managed to do that twice in a really interesting and compelling way that felt different from each other, but also kind of worked within their own story.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's something he's talked about in interviews where if you look back at like the old Agatha Christie or sort of similar type murder mysteries, they often do have a very specific sense of time and place. Like a lot of them are like either just before or during or just after World War II, or the events that happen like tie into whatever's happening in world history right now. Like it would be one of those things where the politics or whatever was happening of the time wasn't the central thing, but it gave it this very specific grounding. And I think that's what he's doing in a modern sense. Like Knives Out isn't about immigration. It's not about Trump in the specific
Yeah.
way, but by letting those things fill in the background color essentially, by letting that inform the texture of the movie, and certainly it gives the dynamics between the characters a whole different light, especially when they actively acknowledge and sort of so that way it like in a roundabout way, even though it makes it very of its time, it kind of makes it a little more timeless because it commits so much to being this thing while still being very deliberately anachronistic with all the mystery tropes and the very nature of the sort of genius detective character.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, that's something I'm not familiar with a whole lot of Agatha Christie stories, or so I'd be curious to see going back, if I ever get around to these films, or these films that were stories that were inspired by Ryan Johnson to create these 2 movies. I'd be curious to know a bit more of like, okay, I could see where he got some of the influence it was, because I was rewatching Clue the other night, and I because I it's been a long time since I'd seen it, and rewatching that, I'm like, yeah, I could definitely see the vibes from Clue, and how Ryan Johnson implemented that into these Knives Out movies, particularly the first one. And the other note I want to bring up, since even though despite this only being a lone screenplay nominee, I want to bring up the fact that some of the production design I thought was pretty good, because I thought, I was told apparently the Christopher Plummer painting that we see all throughout the house with him in the chair was done through CG, because at the time of filming they didn't have like a full painting render done in time for shooting it, but they got it finished afterwards. But there's other aspects to the house I really liked. The who was her name? Meg. When Meg, who's Joni's daughter, is trying to get the stash off of an area. It's in a like little drawer with the statue on it. That's shaped like an angel, with them looking like they're shushing someone.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
and then that also ties back in, I think, later on, when it's revealed that the maid had also put the toxicology report in there, or made a copy of it and put it in that same drawer. I thought that was pretty interesting overall. I'm just looking through the rest of my notes.
Well, while you're doing that, I'm actually glad that you brought up the production design because that was the thing besides the screenplay that I was genuinely shocked to see the film not get nominated for, because I think it's genuinely stellar work. I mean, first of all, Lakeith Stanfield's character has, I think, a line at one point about Thrombey that the man basically lived on a clue board,
Yep.
and I think that's a great sort of starting point in terms of visualizing this house that we spend so much of the movie in, where there's all these little details, like the painting, like you said, which, it kind of looks like the facial expression subtly changes throughout the movie depending on what's going on. And like little things like I love his mug, the "My House, My Coffee, My
Yeah, that was
Rules,"
great.
which ends up playing perfectly into the film's final shot, which I just love so much.
Yeah.
And yeah, all the little details throughout the house, like, you see his books, but you see little things and the little trap doors and the way things sort of fold into each other. It's so inspired, and there's so much little details within the details. And then of course that the chair with like sort of the inverse Game of Thrones style,
Oh yeah, that was great.
semicircle of knives.
Yeah.
That's like an incredible just piece of set design.
Yeah. I'm actually discovering this right now as we speak. David Crank, who is the production designer on Knives Out, did get an Oscar nomination. It was a year later though for News of the World.
Interesting.
Yeah. I will agree. Yeah, the production design is really good, and we'll probably talk a bit more about what other like possible nominations this film could have gotten. But I remembered the production design category that year was already really stacked with, in my opinion, some really impressive nominees, so to speak, within their own creative ways, with like Parasite, Irishman, and then Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. So I could see why it wasn't in to begin with, but it would have been nice if it managed to get in, period. But I'm pretty sure the Art Directors Guild did nominate it for the category for production design for them.
That sounds right. As Joey is fond of saying at Awards Radar, it may very well have been like the 6 or 7, out of the five.
Oh yeah, definitely. I did love some of the other lines in the film with Michael Shannon when he's talking to Ransom. He's like, "How about some more cookies? You want some more cookies?" And he's like shoving it in his
Yeah.
face. I thought that was great. And even like we got to talk if we can about Chris Evans in the film, which in my opinion, from what I've seen of Ryan Johnson's films, this might be my favorite character Ryan's made with Chris Evans'
Oh,
character.
okay.
Just because I like first off, it was refreshing and it was nice to see Chris Evans showing off a bit more of his like comedic range. Not that he's never done so before. Like I'm whenever I think of Chris Evans, I think of mostly his time in the Marvel Cinematic Universe as Captain America. And it was kind of refreshing for me to see him do a bit more of dramatic work like this, and even just the way his character's thinking. And I really like the way his character is written too, not just with like the funny quips, but even with just the way that his character is presented in the film. Like I was reading in it, I was online an hour or so ago finding out that Ryan Johnson's intention with the costume designer Jenny Egan, I think her the name was, the costume designer on the film,
Yeah, that sounds right.
um, where they wanted to have Ransom's look be, very, like it's very flashy and kind of expensive, but but it's not really properly taken care of, and it kind of
Mhm.
plays into that personality of Ransom, almost like kind of a foreshadowing of what would happen if he were given his share of the money. Where it's obviously like, hey, look, I'm a rich guy, but I'm not really taking care of a whole lot of things in my own ways. And so I thought that was interesting. And yeah, and I still get a crack up at my favorite line from him was when he said to the family, "I think this could be the best thing to happen to all of you." And it
Yeah.
ties and I'm pretty sure that's what his parents said to him. It's like, "Yeah, this is the best thing that could happen to you for being cut out of the will."
Exactly, so then he gets to throw it back at
Yeah,
them.
and so I thought that was really funny. There's a couple other things I'll mention as we're wrapping up soon. I did find some of the editing at times to be pretty good, particularly when Michael Shannon's character shows up at Anna de Armas's house.
Oh, yeah, and there's, like, the intense close-ups on, like, him walking with the cane and, like, tightening his grip on things. Yeah, that's really effective, I
Yeah,
thought.
and it shows the like claustrophobia that from Marta's point of view with like the letter she's seeing, and then all of a sudden he's there at her door, like, "Hey, what's up?"
Mhm.
I thought that was really good editing. I'm looking through here. We also have to thank Ryan Johnson for telling us that no villains are allowed to hold an iPhone, so to speak, or have one on screen with them. I thought that was a pretty interesting note that he pointed out.
Yeah, yeah.
And going back real quick to the opening, I thought it was great when we were able to cut around with Jamie Lee Curtis's character, Michael Shannon, Don Johnson, and Tony Collette. when we got around to each of their characters and the way that their reactions were very different from not just the way they interacted with Benoit Blanc. You know, Jamie Lee Curtis is very strict, and he's like, "If you think I'm going to give up any of my family's secrets, you're dead wrong." And then it cuts immediately to Don Johnson's like, "Yeah, of course they had an argument over the next room." You know, they were talking about the book deals going on. I thought that was pretty funny, and even with the way that he presses a key on the piano to tell the detectives, "Okay, let's try to move this interrogation along so we can get to the next person." You know, just it really does show, like, again, detail in the writing and even the way the actors put enough detail into their own personality and characters to make them stand out. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, and I think what's brilliant, sort of to piggyback off of your thoughts there, what's brilliant about that whole sequence is that because it comes quite early in the film, and with a lot of these characters, it's the first time or only the second time that we're meeting them. And so you're learning sort of the core information that you need to about them for the mystery to then progress. But like it never feels like exposition. It always feels like this is important information that the characters would be talking about in the context of the investigation. And by cross cutting between them, one editing trick that he does that I think is really effective is he'll like have each of them talk about how they remember the party,
Yes.
and then they'll cut to the party. And so, like, you know, Jamie Lee Curtis remembers it was her and Don Johnson giving him the cake, but Michael Shannon's like, no, it was me and my wife who gave him the
Mhm.
cake. And like little things like that that show like they clearly all either have their own biases of like what they think happened or what they want other people to think happened. Sometimes not even in a way to interfere with the investigation, but just for petty sort of status reasons, or just because, you know, they want to, you know, seem more impressive to the other family members. So it's a great way to sort of, you know, go through a lot of, you know, plot setup and introduce us to all these characters, but at the same time create these great ping-ponging events. So your brain's already starting to work on the mystery without feeling like you need so much exposition up top just to get started.
And even with that, when Don Johnson was being asked by Daniel Craig, you know, the maid, was bringing stuff into the house, and we heard Harlan say to you, you better tell her or I will." And we were shown like what actually happened, and then Don Johnson like, "Oh yeah, yeah, no, it was just the fact that he wanted me to tell Jamie Lee Curtis that we were going to take him into a nursing home, and I didn't want to, all that stuff." And I that's also tied back into the finale too, where it's implied that they probably got a divorce after it was revealed by Harlan's note that Don Johnson was having an affair with someone else. And yeah, I thought that was really interesting. And even though the ending is very much your typical, gotta cross off your T's and your dots with the explaining the whole exposition dump. I thought it was interesting in the way it was presented, both visually and even from an actor standpoint with Benoit Blanc. But I also loved when Benoit Blanc was like, "Enter Benoit Blanc," and then Lakeith Stanfield like, "Okay, look, we get it. You're full of yourself." And then the other guy's like, "Shh, no, 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 he's on a roll. Let him finish." So
Let him
yeah, let
cook.
him cook. I was like, hey, and we've also, and yeah, it was established early on in the film that he was like a huge fan of these like detective books, not like Keith Stanfield, but the other detective who was played by Noah C.
Noah
Yes,
Segan, who is a regular in all of Ryan Johnson's films.
and he's also in the next one too, as a completely different character, I believe.
I love him in the next one. He's so
Yeah,
funny.
I did want to hear your final thoughts on the overall film, and out of curiosity, what would was this film worthy of its sole nomination to begin with?
Yeah, 100%. I think it would have been like because as you very accurately mentioned, it was a pretty competitive year at the Oscars. There was so much going on, and a lot of the masters had like some of their most important or interesting films in a while, sort of all competing with each other. So the fact that it did break through in screenplay is, you know, impressive, but also incredibly well deserved because I think there's so much craft and care and genuine inventiveness that's gone into the screenplay. It's not just, you know, an especially well done murder mystery. It's a murder mystery that has something today to say about, you know, the time that it came out that still resonates today. It's, you know, it's something that isn't just going to take the easy tropes and find the easy solutions. Like, yeah, like you said, it does do the sort of, the cliche of having the detective spell everything out at the end. But in a story this complicated by design, you do kind of need that, and you need that catharsis. And he's smart enough to, again, subvert your expectations, but never at the expense of your entertainment. And I think that balancing act absolutely starts on the page.
Yeah, yeah, you summed it up really well. I'm really glad it got the lone screenplay nomination myself. Even though it probably wouldn't have been my personal pick, I still thought there were at least 3 other screenplays better than this, but it's I gotta say, it's funny when the weakest, in my opinion, the weakest nominee is 1917. It's a pretty good lineup, I gotta say, especially with Parasite, Marriage Story in there, and again, I thought Hollywood was like a really well written screenplay for sure, but I'm really glad it got nominated for this. I don't know about you if, at the time if you were predicting this, but I actually thought Booksmart was going to get in over 1917 at the time, and I thought, oh, okay, I guess we'll get Knives Out and Booksmart in here, but I was proven wrong.
As like both being lone screenplay nominees. Yeah, I think I definitely, well, and I think you weren't alone. I think a lot of people at the time would have said Booksmart could have, or at the very least should have, sort of been in there. And it's a shame, because I would say that would absolutely be the kind of film that's worthy of an episode on something like here. Very sort of screenplay driven project that in a less crowded year certainly they like to reward. But that's the thing about the Oscars. It's pretty cutthroat.
Yeah, and other years, you don't get in. Either you never get in and that was your only chance, or hey, we'll welcome you into the club in the near future. We don't know. So my other question I wanted to ask was, would you nominate the film in other categories? I know you already spoken about production design, but is there any other categories besides original screenplay would you have nominated Knives Out in?
Sure. So yeah, production design would be a gimme. I would say, the fact that we went back and forth on the editing for quite a bit definitely indicates that I think is definitely worthy of consideration. I love Nathan Johnson's score and how it evokes sort of like that very old-timey feel while still very feeling very exciting and
Mhm.
quick-paced. As far as the actors, I mean, I adore what Daniel Craig's doing, although I don't know that it's necessarily an Oscar type performance. But if I had my personal druthers, I would say Ana de Armas deserved a look in for supporting actress.
Yeah, especially when Scarlett Johansson got nominated twice that same year.
Yeah, it feels like there was room.
Yeah, and I haven't seen it yet, but I've been told Kathy Bates wasn't really that deserving of a nomination for Richard Jewell. Yeah. I guess for me, yeah, original screenplay, yeah, production design would have been nice. I don't know if I can quite go with score though, just because I thought the score was nice, but it wasn't anything it wasn't like as like crucial to its movie like some of the other nominees that year. Say for Star Wars, which is just repeating some Star Wars music in the past, and that's about it.
That's fair. Would you, real quick on the score, would you agree with this? Because it's Nathan Johnson in Glass Onion as well. I think the score is far more distinctive and memorable in Glass Onion. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I totally do. In fact, I don't know if we had this conversation in regards to the score this year. I'm not sure if I told you this, but this is so far the only time where I actually like Thomas Newman's music in 1917. Yeah, it's the only time I've ever liked it, like that score, like any score from him was that year. Um,
That's so interesting. I've
yeah,
liked quite a few of his, but it's an acquired taste, I guess.
Yeah, and I like my but like yeah, yeah, just like I said real quick, like I said, I think the biggest issue I have with him is just like he's always like it's not like it kind of suffers with some of the problems I have with some of this score with Knives Out for Nathan Johnson, but more of an issue with Thomas Newman where there's parts in the score that are either forgettable for Thomas Newman or they don't fit with the vibe and the tone the director's trying to invoke with us. And 1917 was like the only case for me where it's like, wow, like the score actually works and it's Tom Newman isms that he has where it's like this classical piano, like, melancholy tone. It actually fits for a movie like this. I don't know. It's just something that I was like, wow, it actually worked for me. And by the end of it, I was like, all right, this is like the one time where Thomas Newman actually provided a really good score. And I've been trying to get through some of his earlier stuff like American Beauty and Finding Nemo and some of his other stuff, and even the Bond movies he did. And I'm like, I'm
Have
it kind
you
of yeah, kind of grinds
speaking
to a
of
halt. Go ahead.
sure, speaking of his collaborations with Sam Mendes, have you seen Road to Perdition?
I think I tried watching it, and that was another score where I was like, no, I'm not really vibing with this music.
Interesting. I was gonna say that one's kind of a standout for me, and I like what he's doing in American Beauty too. I've talked at length about why I can't go back to that movie, but I think on its own, I like the choices that are happening there. And also, he
Yeah.
did Wally. Wally's forever.
Yeah, I'll have to revisit Wally because I remember being in it was like a sound design class and someone was presenting that clip and I was like, huh, okay, yeah, I'm not really the biggest fan of Thomas Newman, but we'll see what happens when when I rewatch it again because it's been years since I've seen Wally and I've recently been rewatching some of Pixar's older films and I've noticed some of them hold up really well, like the first two Toy Stories and others don't, but I'm glad I watched them just for a nostalgic point of view. But yeah, like I said, going back to Knives Out, like I said, I think original score. I'm sorry, excuse me, original screenplay. I apologize. I would say original screenplay and production design would probably be like the only two that I would give the film, maybe. But that's just me. So yeah, like I said, I just wanted to say once again, Miles, thank you so much for your time on here on the show. Before we sign off officially, is there anything you'd like to plug in to our listeners or where we could follow you, so to speak?
Yeah, totally. Well, you can find me on both Twitter and Letterboxd at Miles on Film. That's Myles on Film. I do most of my film thoughts on Twitter, at least until the site dies or we all can collectively agree on what the replacement is going to be. So yeah, if you want to see, straight out of the thoughts or straight out of the theater thoughts on various movies or links to the various stuff I'm doing, that's probably the best place for it. You can also find me on Instagram at Marvelous Miles, but I don't really post there very often. And yeah, every week you can find me on the Awards Radar podcast. We usually come out with new episodes every Thursday. And if you want to go on YouTube, you can check out two of my most recent short films, American Exorcist and Once Upon a Dracula. They're both on YouTube under Aftershock Pictures and Chase Capo, respectively.
Awesome. And as for me, you can follow me and the show through Linktree under at Matthew995, where you can follow along on all of my social media accounts such as Twitter, Threads, Instagram, and Letterbox. On the same site, I've also provided the links for where you can find more episodes as they're released on various audio streaming services. We were able to get Google Podcasts and iHeartRadio connected, so if you're not able to view this episode or any of our episodes on Spotify, you have other podcast variety there to choose from. And if you're interested in being in the hot seat like Miles did today, let me know and hopefully we can arrange that happening in the near future. In the meantime, we hope to see you at the movies and take care, guys.
Bye, y'all.